The woods behind the Langford estate never belonged to the living. Even now, when the air is heavy with cicadas and the red soil steams after rain, there's a silence beneath the sound awaiting. Locals say that if you stand near the old willow at midnight, you can hear two women whispering in unison, their voices soft and wrong, like an echo that learned to breathe. In 1842, when the Langford twins were born, the midwife claimed she saw a shadow pass over the room, though the shutters were closed tight. Clara and Celine grew up mirror-perfect, their beauty both blessing and omen, their bond the kind that defied separation and invited dread. They were daughters of wealth and cruelty, raised on land that whispered of sins buried deep. When Elias arrived, tall, scarred, and silent, something in the air shifted. The sisters watched him from the veranda, their pale faces framed by lace and envy, their hearts pulsing with something neither understood. The nights grew hotter, the whispers thicker. And soon, the twins who shared everything would share him too, until the forest itself turned against them, hungry for what they had taken, and unwilling to let their secret die. No one remembers when the Langford house first began to rot, or when its windows started reflecting faces no one recognized. But some say it began the night two daughters of privilege and one man bound by chains disappeared into the woods together, and only one came back carrying a child that didn't belong to this world. In 1842, the Langford estate stood like a crown of decay amid the endless green of Alabama's countryside, where the air was thick with humidity and history that refused to die. The Langfords were known far and wide not for kindness or grace, but for their land, their cotton, and their quiet cruelty that clung to their name like the moss that dripped from the old oaks. When Elias arrived at the plantation, he was little more than another transaction, another name written in the family's ledgers between the price of a mule and a shipment of tobacco. He was young, maybe 20, strong from years of labor, his skin marked by the violence of survival and the defiance of endurance. The overseer called him silent, but his silence was not submission, it was resistance wrapped in patience. The Langford twins, Clara and Celine, were 17 then, identical in every visible way, yet separated by an invisible fracture that only those closest to them could sense. They moved through the halls like reflections trapped in glass, always together, always whispering to each other in tones no one else could decipher. When Elias was brought to the estate, something in their world shifted. His presence disturbed the symmetry of their existence, the same way a drop of ink stains still water. It began with glances stolen from the veranda as he worked the fields, shirt damp with sweat beneath the sun, his movements deliberate and defiant. For the first time, the sisters' eyes didn't mirror each other, they followed different paths, drawn by something neither could name. Elias's arrival did more than introduce temptation, it awakened the house itself. The servants spoke of the sudden chill in the halls, of the way the twins' laughter began to sound hollow, of footsteps echoing when no one was there. Their father, Judge Langford, paid it no mind. To him, Elias was property, a tool to command, a pair of hands meant for work and nothing more. But to Clara and Celine, he became a forbidden pulse beneath the monotony of privilege, a reminder that something alive still beat beneath their corseted lives. The estate, isolated and rotting behind its grandeur, seemed to sense it too, the beginning of a breach between sin and silence. On the first night Elias slept in the quarters by the tree line, the wind carried whispers across the fields. The slaves claimed they heard the river murmur his name, as though warning him that the land he now belonged to had swallowed men before and would do so again. By dawn, the Langford sisters had already spoken his name in secret, and though the sun rose as it always did, nothing about that day would ever be ordinary again. The Langford twins had always been bound by something stronger than blood, an unspoken pact that seemed to reach beyond the natural world. Since childhood, Clara and Celine had moved in harmony, speaking in half-phrases that only the other could finish, feeling emotions that seemed to echo across their shared reflection. But as the months passed after Elias's arrival, that harmony began to warp. The two sisters found themselves drawn to the same figure, yet for different reasons. Clara, the softer and quieter of the two, was fascinated by Elias's silence, the calm gravity that seemed to linger around him. Celine, fiery and willful, was drawn to his strength, the rebellion that flickered behind his restrained gaze. What began as fascination turned into something that unsettled both of them, though neither dared to speak it aloud. In the heavy Alabama heat, boundaries blurred easily. Days melted into nights, and the twins often wandered past the cotton fields under the pretense of watching over the workers. Their eyes found Elias more often than they should have, and each time, they stayed longer than decency allowed. Servants began to whisper of how the twins' laughter had changed, how it carried an edge, sharp and uneven, as if something inside them was fighting to be freed. The sisters themselves could feel it too, a quiet envy blooming between them, a sickness neither could name. At night, in their shared room, they spoke of him in whispers, pretending their fascination was a passing curiosity. Yet beneath every word was a tremor of something forbidden, something alive. The Langford house, once filled with piano music and perfumed light, began to feel oppressive. The mirrors seemed to follow them, reflecting their faces back not as one, but as two separate beings divided by desire. Their father noticed the change, though he misread it as the restless temperament of youth. To him, his daughters were delicate ornaments, his property as much as Elias was. But the sisters' bond, once pure, was turning into a quiet rivalry that neither could escape. Each began to keep secrets, sneaking away at odd hours, finding reasons to wander near the slave quarters where Elias worked. And though neither saw the other watching, both knew. It was in those long, humid nights that the darkness between them deepened. They began dreaming of the same place, a clearing in the woods where the air pulsed with heat, where the sound of the river was drowned out by a heartbeat that belonged to no one and everyone. The sisters, bound by love and reflection, were becoming something else entirely, two mirrors facing each other, trapping an image that could never escape. The bond that once made them whole was starting to consume them. The night Clara first went to Elias was one of those heavy Alabama nights when the air clung to the skin and the world felt suspended between breath and storm. The cicadas were loud, the moon pale behind a veil of clouds, and the old house had fallen into uneasy silence. Clara had told herself she only meant to bring food to the slave quarters, a gesture of pity, she claimed, though she knew it was something else entirely. She moved barefoot through the garden path, her white nightgown brushing against the wet grass, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might betray her. Every shadow seemed alive, every branch reaching toward her like the hands of the dead. Still, she went on, pulled by something she could neither explain nor resist. Elias was sitting outside the quarters when she found him, his face lit faintly by the glow of a dying lantern. He did not speak when he saw her, his eyes met hers and held there, steady, unflinching. Clara tried to speak but could not form the words. The food basket she carried trembled in her hands before falling softly to the ground. The distance between them was filled with a silence so thick it seemed to hum. She had never been looked at that way before, not as the judge's daughter, not as a twin, but as a woman. And in that look, something broke loose inside her. The world beyond that moment vanished. The rustling of the trees, the chirping of the night all dissolved into a kind of breathless stillness. Elias did not move first. He simply waited, as if he knew she had already decided. When she stepped closer, the air seemed to change, the woods holding their breath as though aware of the sin unfolding beneath their watch. What happened next was not tender, nor cruel, it was inevitable, the kind of act that feels written long before either body arrives to fulfill it. When it was done, Clara felt both alive and ruined. She could not tell which feeling frightened her more. She returned to the house before dawn, her gown damp with dew, her pulse still unsteady. The river mist curled around her ankles as she crossed the path, as though trying to pull her back. Inside the mansion, Celine was awake, sitting by the window, her eyes already on her. She said nothing, only watched her sister pass by with an expression that was neither surprise nor anger, something deeper, darker, as if she had known all along. From that night on, the air in the Langford house grew colder, though summer had only just begun. Celine found out the truth not through words, but through the quiet tremors that passed between her and Clara. The twins had always shared an unspoken language, one that existed beyond sound, and that night it betrayed them. Clara's silence, her distracted eyes, the faint scent of earth and smoke on her gown all spoke louder than any confession could. Celine waited until morning before confronting her, her voice calm but her hands shaking. When Clara tried to deny it, her twin only smiled, a slow, knowing curve of the lips that made Clara's heart falter. Celine had known all along. The moment Elias had looked at her sister a certain way in the fields, she had felt it, the shift, the pull, the quiet theft of something she considered half her own. But what shocked Clara most was not that Celine knew, it was what she demanded. She did not scream or curse or threaten to tell their father. She said only that what one twin experienced, the other must share. It had always been that way between them: pain, joy, secrets, dreams. They had shared everything since birth, and now Celine insisted that Elias would be no different. Her voice was steady, her tone neither cruel nor pleading, just certain, as though she were invoking an ancient rule the world had forgotten. Clara's protest died before it could form. Something about Celine's calmness frightened her, something in the way her eyes gleamed, cold and unwavering. That night, it was Celine who went to the slave quarters. The house was asleep, and the air smelled of rain. Elias was inside when she entered, startled at first, thinking it was Clara returning. When he realized who stood before him, something unreadable flickered across his face. Celine didn't explain, didn't pretend to bring food or comfort. She stood there in silence, as if daring him to look at her the same way he had looked at her sister. The resemblance between them was perfect, yet the energy in the room had changed. What had been hesitant and tender before now felt charged, almost dangerous. Elias's hesitation lasted only a breath. The act that followed was not love, nor entirely consent, it was something darker, born of confusion, pride, and the desperate tangle of power that governed every soul on that land. When Celine returned before dawn, her face was pale but calm, her expression unreadable. Clara waited for her in their shared room, tears streaming down her face, but Celine only lay beside her and took her hand. "Now we are even," she whispered. From that night on, their bond was no longer sacred. It was stained, split down the middle, and neither of them would ever truly belong to themselves again. The river had always been the Langford twins' refuge, a place where the world's rules seemed to blur under the shifting reflections of the water. It was there, beneath the weeping branches of an old willow, that Clara and Celine met in secret after the nights that had changed everything. The dawn mist clung to the surface of the Alabama River, thick and gray, swallowing their voices as they stood side by side without speaking. For a long while, only the sounds of the current and the faint rustle of leaves filled the silence between them. Clara's eyes were red from crying, Celine's were hollow and distant. What they had done could not be undone, and both knew it. They had crossed a line that had no return, and now the question that hung between them was not what would happen next, but who Elias truly belonged to. It was Celine who finally spoke, her tone cold and deliberate. She said that they could not let the world, or their father, discover the truth. She reminded Clara of the punishment that would follow, the ruin that would stain their family name, and the horror that would befall Elias if their secret ever reached another ear. Clara listened, trembling, torn between fear and guilt. Yet beneath Celine's words was something more dangerous than fear, a twisted sense of possession, as though she believed that what they had done was a binding act, one that tethered all three of them together forever. When Clara asked which of them Elias had truly cared for, Celine laughed softly, the sound brittle and sharp as glass. "It doesn't matter," she said. "We'll never let anyone know. Not even him." So they made a pact there by the riverbank, with their bare feet sinking into the mud and the morning sun just beginning to rise. They swore that neither would ever reveal what had happened, not to their father, not to the servants, not to the world. More than that, they vowed that neither would ever claim Elias's heart or his child, should one of them conceive. They would carry their secret like a shared wound, identical as their faces, and take it to their graves. To seal it, Celine reached into the water and drew her finger across the surface, watching their reflections ripple and merge. Clara hesitated before doing the same, whispering words she didn't understand. The wind shifted then, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the river itself had heard them and agreed. The sisters walked back to the house without looking back, unaware that what they had called a promise was, in truth, a curse that would follow their bloodline long after their bodies had turned to dust. By the time the summer heat gave way to the chill of autumn, both Clara and Celine began to change. Their skin paled, their tempers grew unpredictable, and they withdrew from the world beyond the iron gates of the Langford estate. The servants whispered first, noting the strange morning sickness, the faint swelling beneath their corsets, and the way they clutched their stomachs when they thought no one was watching. The twins denied everything, but the truth was already taking shape within them, undeniable and growing stronger each day. They were both with child, bound not only by blood but by the same secret that now lived under their ribs. The Langford mansion, once filled with laughter and the music of the piano, had grown silent. Only the sound of footsteps echoed through the halls at night, and sometimes, soft crying could be heard from the twins' rooms. Their father, Judge Langford, remained blind to the truth. To him, their weakness was a matter of frailty, an illness born of heat and feminine delicacy. When the family doctor came, Celine feigned fainting spells while Clara hid behind a veil of shyness, and the old man declared it nothing more than exhaustion. The judge ordered them confined indoors until their health improved, and so the house became their prison. Behind those locked doors, the twins' bond, once fractured by jealousy, turned into a quiet, desperate dependence. Clara's nights were filled with fear, while Celine's were ruled by a strange calm acceptance, as though she saw herself as chosen for this fate. As their bodies changed, so too did the atmosphere of the house. Servants began to quit without notice, murmuring about strange noises in the nursery that had long been abandoned. They spoke of the scent of iron that lingered in the corridors, of whispers that came from the old mirrors when no one was near. Even the wind outside seemed to howl differently, carrying with it the weight of something unseen. The twins grew more secretive, keeping to the shadows, their faces pale under the flicker of candlelight. At night, they met by the window, staring out toward the woods where Elias had once worked. Sometimes they imagined they could see his figure moving through the trees, though they knew it was impossible. Still, neither could speak his name aloud. The river beyond the fields seemed to murmur it anyway, repeating it in the rustle of reeds and the soft current that flowed past their land. As the months passed, their father's suspicion grew, but so did the twins' silence. When their conditions could no longer be hidden, a storm rolled across Alabama, darkening the sky for 3 days, as if the heavens themselves were mourning what was about to be born into the world. The night Elias vanished, the air over the Langford estate was electric with the promise of a storm. The trees bent under the rising wind, and the sky pulsed with flashes of distant lightning that illuminated the cotton fields in ghostly white. Inside the mansion, Clara lay awake, restless and uneasy, while Celine paced the length of their room in silence. Both had sensed it, a shift, a stirring in the stillness that made their hearts race. Something was coming. Down by the quarters, the slaves whispered prayers and refused to leave their cabins, claiming they had seen figures moving along the tree line that weren't entirely human. When the first thunder cracked across the heavens, Elias was gone. The discovery came at dawn. The overseer, sent to inspect the fields, returned pale and trembling. Elias's quarters were empty, the door hanging open, the chains that had once bound him snapped clean through. The earth outside bore strange, uneven footprints that led toward the woods, as though several people had walked there but none had returned. In the center of the path was a single imprint that seemed larger, deeper, as if something had knelt or pressed down into the soil with unnatural weight. The judge ordered a search at once, sending men and dogs into the forest, but the hounds refused to go past the willow trees by the riverbank. They whined and backed away, tails low, eyes wide. It was said that the animals could sense what men could not, the boundary between the living and the cursed. Clara was inconsolable when she heard. She locked herself in her room for 2 days, refusing food or company, whispering Elias's name into the darkness as though he might answer. Celine, on the other hand, did not cry. She stood by the window for hours, her face unreadable, her gaze fixed on the forest where he had disappeared. When she finally spoke, her words chilled her sister to the bone. "He didn't run," she said quietly. "He was taken." That night, thunder rolled again across the valley, and the servants swore they saw figures moving in the distance, 1 man and 2 women, walking hand in hand through the rain toward the river. Some claimed the man's wrists still bore broken chains that glowed faintly under the lightning. The next morning, the footprints by the riverbank had returned, fresh and deep in the mud, leading into the water but never out again. The Langford house fell into an uneasy silence after that. No one spoke of Elias, and no one dared to go near the woods once the sun went down, for the sound of chains dragging through the leaves could sometimes be heard long after midnight. Winter crept over Alabama like a slow suffocation, turning the fields to gray ash and the sky to lead. The Langford estate, once a proud monument of Southern wealth, had become a tomb of whispers. Within its walls, the twins hid from the world, each heavy with child, each haunted by the memory of the man who had vanished into the woods. Servants no longer dared to speak Elias's name, yet his absence hung over the house like smoke that would not clear. As the twins' bellies swelled, so did the tension between them. Clara grew frail and pale, her hands trembling whenever she tried to sew or play piano, while Celine remained coldly composed, moving through the house with the quiet determination of someone who had made peace with the inevitable. Their father, unaware of the truth, believed his daughters to be suffering from the same mysterious illness, and he forbade anyone to enter their rooms without permission. When the labor pains began, they came like waves of fire and water, one twin screaming moments after the other. The servants ran through the halls, fetching blankets and water, their prayers mixing with the howling wind outside. Clara's cries filled the mansion first, desperate and unending, while Celine's came softer but steadier, her expression unreadable as she gripped the sheets and stared toward the ceiling. As the storm raged over the estate, a midwife was called from the nearby settlement, but by the time she arrived, one of the births was already over. Clara's child was stillborn. The midwife found her shaking and bloodless, clutching a tiny, motionless body to her chest. She refused to let go, whispering the same name again and again, Elias, until her voice broke into silence. Down the hall, Celine's labor continued. Hours later, as dawn struggled to break through the storm clouds, a second cry rose from the east wing of the mansion. It was the sound of a newborn, sharp, alive, defiant. But those who heard it swore there was another cry layered beneath it, faint and distant, as if two voices had come into the world and one had already begun to fade. By morning, the house was still. The servants who tended to the twins said that only one infant was shown to the family. No one ever saw Clara's baby again, though the midwife claimed to have seen 2 blankets laid out on the floor, both marked with blood. That night, when the storm finally passed, the sound of a child crying could still be heard from the garden, drifting faintly from the direction of the woods. No one dared to follow the sound, and by dawn, even that had disappeared, leaving behind only silence and the scent of wet earth that lingered for days. Years turned to decades, and the Langford estate began to sink beneath the weight of its own secrets. The twins' story became a whisper passed down through generations, a tale spoken in low voices by those who dared to linger too long near the river. The once grand mansion, stripped of its elegance, stood rotting and hollow, its windows shattered and its halls filled with dust. The surviving Langford bloodline, scattered and cursed, carried with it a quiet unease, a sense that something followed them, something that would not die. The family tried to rebuild, to restore their fortune, but strange misfortunes clung to them like a shadow. Children fell ill without cause, mirrors cracked in empty rooms, and every few years, someone swore they heard crying at night even when no infants lived in the house. Locals came to believe the Langfords were cursed, that the sin of the twin daughters had poisoned the soil itself. They said the land refused peace because it had never been cleansed. Hunters spoke of twin women seen wandering near the riverbank at dusk, their white dresses glowing faintly under the dying light. Some claimed they appeared hand in hand, silent and watching, their faces identical but lifeless, their eyes glimmering like water under the moon. When the wind blew from the east, the old folks said you could hear them whispering, their voices braided together, calling a name that time had tried to forget. Others said it wasn't just the twins that haunted the land but the man who had bound them together in sin and silence. They claimed to hear the clank of chains dragging through the trees, fading only when dawn touched the horizon. Descendants of the family grew fearful of their own heritage. Few dared to visit the old property, and those who did never stayed past sunset. The last Langford heir who lived in the area, a young woman named Evelyn, reported hearing a baby crying near the family crypt. When she followed the sound, it stopped abruptly, and in its place came a low hum, a lullaby her grandmother used to sing but swore she had never learned from anyone. Evelyn left Alabama the next morning and never returned, abandoning the house to the vines and silence. Even now, the locals say the river remembers. On certain nights, when fog rolls in thick and white, people claim to see ripples moving across the water though the surface is still. The trees sway though there is no wind, and a faint melody drifts from the woods, a tune that sounds like 2 voices humming in unison, broken only by the echo of a chain sinking beneath the current. When the land was finally sold more than a century later, The Langford name had long since vanished from local memory. The mansion had collapsed into ruin, devoured by vines and time, its walls swallowed by the forest that had once been tamed by human hands. A construction company purchased the property to clear it for a new housing development, and soon heavy machines rolled over what had once been a graveyard of secrets. Workers spoke little of the place, but the air carried an unnatural stillness, thick and heavy even under the glare of the modern world. On the third day of digging, the machines struck something solid. At first, they thought it was just an old tree root or buried debris from the mansion's remains, but when the dirt was cleared, the truth emerged from beneath the soil like a wound reopening. Two small coffins lay side by side, their wood blackened and soft with age. No names, no markings, only the faint impression of crosses carved by hand. One of the workers called out for the foreman, but before he could respond, another shovel hit something deeper, something larger. It was a third coffin, wider and longer than the others, its lid splintered but intact enough to recognize as old. When they pried it open, expecting bones or relics, they found only rusted fragments of chain, coiled at the bottom like a serpent sleeping in the dark. No remains, no trace of human life, just the cold echo of iron that seemed to hum when touched. The discovery halted construction immediately. The local authorities were called, and archaeologists arrived to examine the site. They determined the smaller coffins dated back to the mid-1800s, around the time the Langford family had lived there. Yet no records existed of any twin infants buried on the property, nor any indication of a burial that matched the third grave. The workers grew uneasy, claiming that at night, their equipment would start on its own, lights flickering without power, the sound of footsteps circling the dig site when no one was there. One man quit after swearing he saw two women standing by the tree line, watching silently before vanishing into the fog. The investigation concluded quietly, and the land was abandoned once again. No one dared to build there after that, not even the developers who owned it. Locals say the earth refused to be disturbed, that the ground itself seemed to shift back over the graves no matter how deep they dug. To this day, nothing grows properly where those coffins were found. The soil remains dark and cold, as though the past still breathes beneath it, guarding its secret in silence, waiting for the next hand bold enough to unearth what should have stayed buried.